There was a time when the world was ruled not by swords, but by fire. In ancient Persia, fire was not just light, it was truth, order, the presence of God itself. And then, one night, the fires went out. Not because Persia was defeated in a single battle, but because an entire civilization crossed a line it could never uncross. This is the story of the night Persia lost its fire, and the moment the ancient world quietly ended. Chapter 1. When fire ruled the world. Before the world was ruled by empires of iron and blood, it was ruled by an empire of order. Its name was Persia. To the ancient Persians, fire was not destruction. It was truth itself. Fire represented Asha, the cosmic order that held the universe together. It was the force that separated right from wrong, light from chaos, and justice from corruption. In a world where most civilizations worshipped gods of war, storms, or kings, Persia chose something radical. It worshipped order. At the heart of this belief was Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic faiths. Long before the rise of Christianity or Islam, Persians believed in a single supreme force, Ahura Mazda, who ruled not through fear, but through truth. Fire became the visible symbol of that invisible power. It burned in temples across the empire, tended day and night, never allowed to die. To let the fire go out was not just negligence, it was a spiritual failure. But Persia was more than a religion. It was the first empire that understood how to rule diversity without destroying it. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in the 6th century BCE, he did something no conqueror before him had done. He did not sack the city, he did not enslave its people. Instead, he allowed different religions to survive, different cultures to govern themselves, and exiled communities, like the Jews, to return home. Power in Persia was not enforced through terror, but maintained through balance. This philosophy shaped the entire imperial system. Persia was divided into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a governor who answered directly to the king. Taxes were standardized, laws were written, roads were built, not for conquest alone, but for communication. The royal road stretched over 1,500 miles, allowing messages to cross the empire in days, not months. Herodotus, a Greek historian often hostile to Persia, admitted something remarkable. Nothing in the world moved faster than the Persian messengers. This was not an empire held together by fear. It was held together by trust and by fire. From Anatolia to the Indus Valley, fire temples stood as silent witnesses to a civilization that believed morality was a cosmic responsibility. Kings were not gods. They were guardians of order. Even the great king himself was bound by the same moral law as the farmer, the soldier, and the priest. Long before Rome would speak of law and citizenship, Persia had already created a blueprint for civilization, an empire where belief, governance, and infrastructure worked together as a single system, where conquest was temporary, but order was eternal. This was the world Persia built, a world illuminated by fire, a world that believed light could outlast the sword. And for centuries, it did. Chapter 2. The Empire that Refused to Break. Most empires shatter the moment they are defeated. Persia did not. Again and again, history tells us Persia lost to Greece, at Marathon, at Salamis, at Plataea. These battles are remembered as triumphs of freedom over tyranny, but that story hides a deeper truth. Persia lost battles. It did not lose itself. After defeat, most empires collapse inward. Their borders rot, Their people rebel. Their identity dissolves. Persia did something different. It absorbed loss, adapted, and continued. The empire adjusted its borders, rebalanced power, and carried on governing one of the largest and most diverse populations the world had ever seen. This resilience came from something rare. Persia did not define itself by military victory. Its identity was not built on domination, but on continuity. The fire still burned. The roads still carried messengers. The satraps still governed. Life went on. Centuries later, when Alexander the Great stormed across Asia, he did not destroy Persia's system. He adopted it. He wore Persian robes. He kept Persian administrators. He ruled like a Persian king, not a Macedonian warlord. Even in conquest, Persia reshaped its conquerors. Then came the Sasanian Empire, a revival, not a replacement. Rising from the ruins of earlier dynasties, the Sasanians restored Persian identity, strengthened Zoroastrianism, and challenged Rome itself. For 400 years, Persia stood as Rome's equal, sometimes its superior. These wars drained both empires. Rome and Persia bled each other dry along endless frontiers. Gold vanished, armies thinned, cities tired. But still, Persia did not break, because Persia was not just an empire. It was a civilization trained to endure. Its people believed the universe itself was a struggle between order and chaos, and that struggle never ended. Defeat was not failure. It was a test. By the early 7th century, Persia still stood, older than Rome, deeper than Greece, more experienced than any power on earth. No one watching could have imagined what was coming next. Not an invasion of steel, but a war of meaning. Chapter 3. The War That Didn't Look Like a War. When the Arab armies emerged from the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, Persia did not see them as an existential threat. That was the first mistake, a mistake that centuries of history would remember. These forces did not march like imperial legions. They carried minimal armor. They built no monuments. They did not promise wealth, gold, or territory. What they carried was something far more dangerous: belief, a simple, direct, uncompromising faith that demanded loyalty, not luxury. Persia, by then, was a giant weary from decades of war. Battles with Byzantium had drained its treasury. Its cities were scarred, its soldiers tired, its nobility fractured by internal rivalries. The people bore heavy taxes, and the hierarchy that had once maintained order now felt oppressive. From the outside, the empire still looked magnificent: towering palaces, elegant roads, and grand armies. But inside, it was hollow, burdened by its own weight. The first engagements were subtle, almost anticlimactic. Persian forces won some skirmishes and lost others. Cities exchanged hands quietly, without the fanfare of conquest. There were no dramatic collapses, no iconic battles that would make the history books in the moment. From afar, Persia seemed unshakable. Yet, the change happening within was invisible, insidious, and far more devastating than any sword. Because this war was never truly about land or armies. It was about worldview. It was about meaning, loyalty, and identity. Islam, the rising faith, offered something the empire had not experienced in centuries: moral simplicity. There were no elaborate priestly hierarchies, no sacred fires requiring constant guardianship, no rituals that only elites could interpret. Just one God, one law, and a community built on shared belief. For ordinary Persians, exhausted by the weight of imperial bureaucracy and the complexity of old religious duties, this clarity felt liberating. Not because Zoroastrianism was weak, but because empire had made it heavy, rigid, and increasingly distant from the lives of its people. Slowly, imperceptibly, the empire began to shift. Persia was not being conquered in the conventional sense. It was being reimagined. The administration adapted. Persian officials began to serve under the caliphate, maintaining their positions and expertise even as the nature of authority changed. The language of the elite softened, gradually absorbing Arabic terms. Fire temples still stood, but fewer people came. The rituals continued, yet their significance was quietly eroding. Life went on, and outwardly the empire functioned as before, but the soul of Persia had begun to drift. There were no walls breached in epic sieges. Capitals were not reduced to ashes. Armies did not vanish overnight. Yet history had already turned a decisive page. The old empire was slowly being transformed into something new, a civilization adapting, surviving, and reshaping itself in silence. By the time the dust settled, the Persian world would look different, not smaller, not weaker, but fundamentally altered. Its sacred fires no longer the source of cosmic authority. And in that quiet, almost invisible war, the fate of Persia, and perhaps of the ancient world, was sealed. Victory and defeat were no longer measured in cities captured or armies destroyed, but in hearts and minds. Chapter 4. The Night, the Fire. Temples went dark. There was no single night when the world realized Persia had changed, and yet there was a night, a moment so quiet that history almost forgot it. It was the night when the fires that had burned for centuries in the heart of the Persian Empire were no longer tended, when the priests who had kept the sacred flames alive for generations ceased to return, when the light that had symbolized cosmic order, truth, and moral balance finally dimmed. These fire temples were not destroyed by sword or siege. There were no armies marching in to crush them. That would have been easier to understand, easier to remember. Instead, the temples were abandoned, one by one, slowly, silently. The most sacred symbol of Persia was not shattered. It was left behind, as if the empire itself had turned its gaze elsewhere. And in that quiet abandonment, something profound happened. The flame had survived centuries of war, famine, and invasion, but it could not survive the shift of belief. When a civilization destroys the symbols of its enemies, those symbols live on in memory. When a civilization stops believing in its own, something far deeper dies. The fire had represented more than light. It represented order, morality, and the very identity of a people who had ruled an empire larger than most in history. To extinguish it was not a violent act. It was a conscious, collective shift. Persia did not lose armies, cities, or treasures in that moment. It lost certainty. The moral compass that had guided kings and commoners alike was no longer the force it had been. Conversion was not instantaneous. Many Persians continued to practice the old rituals in secret. Some blended their beliefs, carrying fragments of the old religion into new practices. Others simply abandoned the rituals, adapting to the changes in silence. Slowly, inevitably, the center shifted. Mosques rose where temples once stood. Scripture replaced flame. What had been visible for centuries, the fire, eternal and untouchable, was now replaced by the unseen word, interpreted and internalized in new ways. It was not conquest that ended ancient Persia. It was silence. The empire's outward structures, roads, administration, armies remained. But the inward light that had defined the civilization was fading. In losing that light, Persia transformed. Its culture would survive in new forms, language, poetry, governance, but the fire, the tangible embodiment of its cosmic order, had gone out. And the world moved forward, unaware of the quiet night that had changed everything. For the Persians, the end was subtle but irrevocable. It was a lesson in the power of belief, in the fragility of identity, and in the quiet moments when history turns its page, without blood, without noise, without spectacle. The empire continued to function, yet it was no longer the Persia of fire and certainty. It had crossed into a new age, one defined not by flame, but by transformation. Chapter 5. Persia didn't fall. It transformed. Persia did not disappear. It did not vanish in flames or crumble beneath the weight of invaders. Instead, it adapted. What the world had once known as an empire of fire transformed into a civilization of thought, language, and enduring influence. The flames may have gone out, but their light had changed shape, and it continued to illuminate the world in ways no sword could achieve. The Persian administrators who once oversaw roads, taxation, and satrapies carried their expertise into the new order. Under the Islamic Caliphate, these officials became the backbone of governance. Their knowledge of law, infrastructure, and diplomacy ensured that the empire did not collapse, but rather evolved. The institutions they built were no longer tied to sacred fire. They were embedded in human organization and intellect. Persia's power, once measured by armies and temples, now extended through the minds of those who ruled, calculated, and wrote. Persian scholars preserved the knowledge of the past. Ancient texts, astronomy charts, medical treatises, and philosophical works survived through careful copying, teaching, and integration into the new world. The wisdom of centuries, once protected by fire temples and royal decree, now traveled along trade routes, libraries, and scholarly courts, reaching Baghdad, Samarkand, and beyond. It was a quiet power, invisible to invaders, yet enduring far longer than any battlefield victory. And then there was the art, the soul of Persia expressed in words, architecture, and poetry. Ferdowsi, the great Persian poet, undertook the monumental task of writing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a work that resurrected Persia's cultural memory. Where fire once kept history alive, words now preserved it. The stories of kings, heroes, and empires, some real, some myth, became the new flames, burning brightly across centuries. Persia's legacy was no longer only political, it had become cultural, moral, and intellectual. The Caliphate itself became Persianized. Science, medicine, philosophy, and astronomy flourished under Persian influence. From Baghdad to Central Asia, Persian thought defined the intellectual and cultural framework of an empire that spanned continents. What had been an empire of light and flame had transformed into a civilization of ideas. The fire may have been gone, but the light endured, diffused into language, knowledge, and art. Persia survived because it understood the one truth all empires eventually face. Survival is not about resisting change, it is about embracing it. Empires die when they cling rigidly to the past. Persia endured because it evolved, because it learned how to transform without losing its soul. And today, when we speak of Iran, we are not speaking of a fallen empire. We are speaking of a civilization that has endured the dark, that has carried its identity forward through centuries of upheaval, conquest, and transformation. Persia did not fall. It learned, adapted, and illuminated the world in new forms. Its story reminds us that the end of one era is often the quiet beginning of another. If you are fascinated by civilizations that survive not through conquest, but through transformation, subscribe to Midnight Empire. We explore the stories of empires that never truly die. They endure, adapt, and illuminate the shadows.